Hello, I'm Matt Brown, and I've written a story for the Mab, which is a retelling of the Mabinogion. And my story is called The Prince and the King, and Another King. Poith, Prince of Dyfed, gripped the reins of his mare and charged into the forest. He was never happier than when riding and hunting with the sun on his back and the wind in his face. He laughed and roared as he rode, ha 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 ha, urging his horse on and on, faster and faster, deeper and deeper into the forest. And the deeper he rode, the thicker the trees became. Before long, their twisted and tangled limbs blocked out the sunlight, and the air filled with a heavy, damp mist. Poith could no longer see his hounds in front of him, and had to follow by listening to their howling song of the chase. Poith kicked on again, crashing through a thicket of trees and out into a beautiful clearing bathed in warm sunlight. After the darkness of the forest, Poith was momentarily blinded and pulled on the reins, stopping his horse. His hounds were standing motionless on the edge of the clearing, as silent as stone. "What is this? What's going on?" bellowed Poith, angry that his fun had stopped. But then he saw what his dogs were staring at, and he fell silent too. There on the other side of the clearing, lying dead among the bluebells, was a beautiful golden stag, and crowding around the fallen beast was a pack of hounds unlike any that Poith had ever seen before. Their ears were bright red, and their coats so white, so dazzling and bright that they seemed to shine like stars. "I wonder who owns these hounds," he muttered to himself, and looked around for the owner of the extraordinary animals. After a time, and finding no one nearby, Poith chased away the white hounds and let his own dogs feast on the stag. But no sooner had they begun when a hooded rider crashed through the trees into the clearing. "What do you think you're doing?" he boomed, his voice as deep as thunder. Poith was startled. He was not used to being spoken to like this. He was much more used to people saying things like, "Oh wow, you're so great, my lord," or "Have you done something with your hair, my lord, because it looks amazing," or "Ha ha 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 ha, that's the funniest thing anyone has ever said, my lord." "What of it?" said Poith. "I've done nothing wrong." The hooded rider jumped down off his horse. "Done nothing wrong? Of course you've done something wrong. You've done everything wrong. You have driven away my hounds that felled this magnificent stag and let your pack feast on it." "I looked for the owner of the hounds, but you were nowhere to be seen," said Poith. "I admit that perhaps I should have waited, but it's not so great a crime, is it?" "Not so great a crime?" shrieked the rider. "Sir, you have stolen from me. Where are you from?" "Dyfed," said Poith. "Well, sir," said the rider, "stealing things may be what happens in Dyfed, but you're not in Dyfed any more. Around here we take a pretty dim view of stealing." "Well, I'm sorry if I've caused offence, sir," said Poith, although he thought the strange rider was making way too much of the whole incident. "Please tell me your name so I may make it up to you." The rider walked closer and threw back his hood. Poith could see lightning flash in his jade-green eyes. "I am Arawn, King of Annwn." Poith suddenly felt cold. "Annwn," he gasped. "The other world?" Arawn nodded. "My lord," said Poith, who was now a little afraid because he had heard many stories of the dead wandering around the other world, "tell me, is there something I can do to win your friendship?" Arawn stared at the prince and thought. "Well," he said eventually, "there is one thing." "Yes, my lord," said Poith, "tell me." "Well," began Aron, "my neighbour is always fighting me. His name is Halfgan. He is the other king of Annwn, and if you could rid me of him, then you would truly be a friend." Poith drew his sword. "Then lead me to him right now, and I shall end your troubles." "Ah, I wish it were so simple," sighed Aron. "But there are rules we must follow. Halfgan and I have arranged to meet a year from tonight by the river. You will be at that meeting. You will fight in my place." Poith thrust his sword back in its sheath. "I will do it." A smile flickered across Aron's face. "But only a king can fight a king. It is the way of things. So you and I must swap appearances. I shall take your body, and you shall take mine." How do we do that?" said Poith, who'd never heard of anyone swapping bodies before. Well, not in Dyfed anyway. It was the sort of thing that probably happened in Carmarthen. "We shall do it with magic," said Aron, his eyes flashing. "It'll be quite painless. We will change lives with each other, and you will fight Halfgan. And just to make sure that the disguise is perfect, you will live for a year at my castle. If my friends and family don't realize the swap, then we'll know that Halfgan won't either. He's not very bright at all." "Then let it be done," said Poith. Aron looked at the prince. "Before you fight Halfgan, there is one thing about him that you must know," he said. "He is a fearsome warrior, but to kill him, you must only strike him once." "Only once?" said Poith. "Why?" The king waved his hand in front of his face. "Well, it's another world kind of thing," he said. "You know, rules and regulations and whatnot. If you hit him with 2 blows, then he will recover. So you need to make sure your first attack counts." He held out his hand. "Agreed?" Poith took his hand and shook it. "Agreed," he said. And so it was that as soon as the deal was struck, the magic took its course, and Poith looked like Aron, and Aron looked like Poith. Then each went back to the other's kingdom and lived there for a year. Poith was astounded and delighted by what he found when he reached Annwn. The food was more delicious than any he'd ever had before. Everyone danced and laughed all day and night, and actually, once you got to know them, the dead weren't so bad after all. Throughout the next year, no one suspected that Aron, king of Annwn, was in fact Poith, prince of Dyfed. Then, on the appointed evening, exactly 1 year since Poith had met Aron in the forest, the prince of Dyfed made his way to the river to fulfill his promise. When he arrived, he saw Halfgan waiting in armour of gold and holding a huge silver shield that shone and sparkled in the moonlight. Around him, noblemen stood and watched Poith as he approached. Then a knight stood forward and spoke. "This is a fight between 2 kings and 2 kings only," he said, addressing all those who gathered. "Each is making a claim to land and territory. All others must stand aside and leave the fighting to the 2 of them." With that, Poith, who looked like Aron, and Halfgan, who looked like his head had been shoved down a toilet, began the fight. Knowing that he must only strike 1 blow, Poith waited and waited, ducking and dodging the attacks of Halfgan. Then, with a speed and strength he did not know he had, Poith thrust his sword at Halfgan's silver shield, which split in half with a deafening crack. Halfgan's armour shattered into 1,000 tiny shards, and Poith's single blow threw him back off his horse, crashing onto the ground. Halfgan lay and begged Poith to attack him again, but Poith knew he could not, and threw down his sword. Halfgan never stood again, and died next to the moonlit river, and as the last breath left his body, the noblemen all fell to their knees at the feet of Poith. The next morning Poith and Aron met for the first time in a year. "Halfgan is dead," said Poith, "and you are the one true king of Annwn." And Aron and Poith became great friends and spent many happy days riding together. and from that day forward, Pwyll was known not as the Prince of Dyfed, but as Prince of the Other World.